The ancient stones of the Northern Pack's ceremonial ground had witnessed countless soul-binding rituals, but none as momentous as the one taking place under tonight's silver moon. Kale Runmar stood at the edge of the sacred circle, his heart hammering against his ribs, as he felt the familiar pull that had been growing stronger with each passing season. The ritual was the most sacred tradition of his people, where fated mates would finally unite their souls under the blessing of the moon goddess herself. Kale was 24 years old, descended from the ancient bloodline of the Northern Pack, and gifted with empathic abilities that set him apart from other Omegas. His sensitivity to emotions and his healing voice had been whispered about since childhood, marking him as special among his people. For months, he had felt the connection building between himself and Taris Elverin, the alpha heir of their pack. Taris was everything tradition demanded in a leader: powerful, commanding, battle-hardened, and ruthless when necessary. His dark hair caught the moonlight like spun shadow, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold calculation of someone born to rule through strength and strategic thinking. The pack had always expected this pairing: the empathic Omega with ancient blood and the warrior Alpha destined to lead their people into a new era. Tonight, according to every sign and portent their people recognized, Kale and Taris would be joined as fated mates, their souls bound together for eternity. The pack elder raised his ceremonial staff, carved from the horn of a great elk and blessed by generations of spiritual leaders. The gathered wolves fell silent, their attention focused on the two figures who represented their pack's future and the continuation of their most powerful bloodlines. Tonight, under the blessing of the silver moon that marks destiny itself, those chosen by fate step forward to claim their eternal bonds. The elder's voice carried across the mountain grove. Let Alpha and Omega unite as the ancient laws decree. Let the moon witness what the heart has always known. Let souls merge as they were meant to since the beginning of time. Kale felt the pull intensify, his Omega nature responding to the call of his destined Alpha. This was it. This was the moment he had dreamed of since he first understood what it meant to be part of a fated pair. He took a trembling step forward, his bare feet silent on the soft earth of the ceremonial ground, his empathic abilities allowing him to feel the anticipation and excitement of the gathered pack. Taris moved as well, his powerful frame cutting through the crowd with predatory grace. Their eyes met across the sacred fire, and for a heartbeat, Kale saw something that made his soul sing with joy: recognition, desire, the fierce possessiveness that marked true fated bonds between Alpha and Omega. The silver thread of their connection became visible in the moonlight, stretching between them like spun starlight, pulsing with the power of destiny itself. Kale reached out his hand, his fingers trembling not with fear but with pure anticipation. Through his empathic gifts, he could feel Taris's emotions, complex, layered, but unmistakably connected to his own. And then his world shattered into 1,000 pieces. I will not bind myself to an Omega who cannot even make me feel the proper instincts. Taris's voice boomed across the grove, loud enough for every wolf present to hear. His words hit Kale like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. You are a mistake of nature, defective, incomplete. I reject this bond, I reject this fate, and I reject you. The silence that followed was deafening. Kale stood frozen, his outstretched hand still reaching for a connection that Taris had just torn apart with brutal efficiency. The pain was indescribable, like someone had reached into his chest and ripped out half his soul, leaving jagged edges that burned with every breath. Through his heightened empathic abilities, he could feel not just his own devastation but the shock, embarrassment, and secret relief of the gathered pack. You dare reject the will of the moon goddess? The elder asked, his voice shaking with disbelief at this unprecedented violation of their most sacred traditions. I dare choose strength over weakness, Taris replied coldly, his gaze never leaving Kale's stricken face. The pack needs an alpha who makes decisions based on reality, not mystical bonds that fail to manifest properly. If this Omega cannot even trigger basic mating instincts, what use is he to our bloodline? But Taris wasn't finished with his destruction. As Kale stood there, broken and humiliated before his entire community, the Alpha took one final step toward him, his voice carrying clearly across the silent grove. "You cannot even make me feel the desire to claim you," he said with devastating precision. "You are nothing to me, Kale Runmar. An incomplete omega, a failed promise, a stain on what should have been a perfect union. You are not worthy of bearing the children of an alpha." The words hit their mark with surgical accuracy, targeting every insecurity Kale had ever felt about his gentle nature, his sensitivity, his difference from other omegas who seemed to inspire instant, overwhelming desire in their alphas. Somehow, Kale managed to turn away from the fire, to walk with as much dignity as he could muster back to the shadows at the edge of the grove. Behind him, the ceremony continued as if nothing had happened, as if his public destruction was just a minor interruption in the evening's festivities. But everything had changed. In the space of a few words, Kale had gone from destined mate of the future alpha to nothing. Worse than nothing. A rejected omega whose very existence was now an embarrassment to the pack, a reminder of failed prophecy and broken tradition. His family, members of the ancient Runmar bloodline, said nothing in his defense. They simply looked away, their silence more damning than any words could have been. The days that followed were a nightmare of whispers and sideways glances. Word of his rejection spread through the northern pack like wildfire, and everywhere Kale went, he felt the weight of their judgment. The pack council met in emergency session to discuss what to do with him. An omega without a mate, especially one who had been publicly rejected in such a spectacular fashion, was seen as cursed, potentially dangerous to the stability of their social order. "Your presence brings discord to our people," Alpha Magnus, Tari's father and current pack leader, told him during the meeting that would decide his fate. The pack leader's weathered face showed no mercy, only cold calculation. "The failed bond has marked you as defective. Perhaps the moon goddess intended for you to be cast out, to serve as a warning to others about the dangers of placing too much faith in destiny alone." They stripped him of everything first. Not just material possessions, but identity itself. He was no longer Kale of House Runmar, descended from generations of healers and empaths who had served their pack with distinction. He was simply the rejected one. A cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting in bonds that could fail so spectacularly. His empathic abilities, once considered a gift, were now seen as evidence of his fundamental wrongness. The pack whispered that his sensitivity had somehow corrupted the natural bond, that his emotional perception had interfered with the proper mating instincts that should have flared between him and Tari's. Then came the exile. They gave him one day to gather what he could carry and leave Northern Pack territory forever. No member of the pack was permitted to aid him or offer shelter. He was to become a lone wolf, cut off from the community that had shaped his entire identity, cast into the wilderness to live or die as true fate intended. On his last night in the only home he had ever known, Kale sat in his small cabin, surrounded by the few belongings he would be able to take with him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Cast out by the very people who had once whispered about his special gifts, exiled by the community he had spent his life trying to serve with his healing voice and empathic understanding. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and pink that he had loved since childhood, Kale began his journey into exile. He walked the familiar paths one last time, memorizing the way the morning light touched the stone formations he had explored as a pup, breathing in the scent of pine and snow that had always meant home and safety. By midday, he had reached the border markers that defined Northern Pack territory. Beyond them lay the wild borderlands, a harsh wilderness where ancient magic had left the very ground unstable, and creatures from other realms sometimes crossed into the mortal world. It was a place where few dared to travel and even fewer survived for long without the protection of a pack. Kale paused at the boundary stones, carved with protective runes that had guarded his people for generations. Once he crossed this line, there would be no going back. He would be truly alone, cut off from everything and everyone he had ever known, forced to survive on his own in a world that had no place for rejected omegas. He stepped across the border and began walking into the unknown, his heart heavy with loss but his spirit not yet entirely broken. The first weeks of exile were a blur of survival instincts and desperate determination. Kale had been trained in basic hunting and foraging, But those skills had always been supplementary to his role as a healer and empath within the pack structure. Hunting for survival in a hostile wilderness was entirely different from the guided expeditions he had participated in during his youth. Game was scarce in the borderlands, and what animals he did manage to catch were often tainted by exposure to wild magic, their meat barely edible and sometimes actively dangerous. The cold was merciless, seeping into his bones despite his werewolf constitution. His empathic abilities, once a source of pride, became a curse as he sensed the malevolent intentions of predators and the alien hostility of the magical creatures that inhabited these forsaken lands. It was during his 4th week in exile that his luck finally ran out completely. Kale had been following what appeared to be a game trail when he was surrounded by a group of rough-looking men armed with nets and magical restraints. Slavers, he realized with growing horror, who specialized in capturing supernatural beings for sale to the highest bidder. Well, their leader said, a scarred human with cold eyes and a predatory smile. What have we here? A lone wolf and an omega at that. You'll fetch a pretty price in the right markets, boy. Kale tried to run, but weakened by weeks of poor nutrition and constant stress, he was no match for their prepared assault. The magical nets they threw over him drained his strength and prevented his transformation, leaving him helpless as they bound him with silver-lined chains that burned against his skin. Rare breed, this one of the slavers observed as they examined their catch. Northern Pack bloodline, if I'm not mistaken. And look at those markings, he's got the old blood, the kind that comes with special talents. The Dragon Lord will pay handsomely for this one. Dragon Lord? Kale managed to ask through his fear and exhaustion. Lientar of the Elkaras Peaks, the leader said with obvious satisfaction. Ancient creature with very specific tastes. He's been looking for someone with musical abilities, and Omega wolves from the old bloodlines are known for their healing voices. You're about to become a very valuable commodity, boy. They transported him in a cage, treating him like an animal rather than a sentient being. The journey to the dragon's mountain stronghold took 3 days, during which Kale was given minimal food and water, just enough to keep him alive and presentable for sale. His empathic abilities were both a blessing and a curse during this time. He could sense the slavers' intentions and avoid their worst impulses, but he also felt the despair and terror of other captives they had taken. The Elkaras Peaks rose before them like jagged teeth against the sky, their snow-covered summits disappearing into clouds that seemed to swirl with unnatural patterns. The dragon's lair was built into the mountainside itself, a fortress of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ancient and imposing, it spoke of power beyond mortal understanding and age beyond human comprehension. When they finally reached the fortress gates, Kale was barely conscious from exhaustion and magical suppression. He was dimly aware of being dragged through corridors lined with tapestries and artifacts that seemed to hum with contained power, of voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, of the overwhelming scent of something ancient and predatory that made his Omega instincts cry out in warning. The great hall where he was finally presented was unlike anything Kale had ever seen. Massive columns supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow, while floating orbs of light provided illumination that cast everything in hues of gold and crimson. Treasures from across the known world were displayed on pedestals and in alcoves, creating a museum of wealth and power that spoke of centuries of accumulation. And seated on a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian was the Dragon Lord himself. Lientar appeared to be in his 30s, though Kale's empathic senses immediately told him that this being was far older than any human or werewolf could ever be. He was tall and lean, with aristocratic features that seemed carved from marble and hair the color of spun silver that fell to his shoulders in elegant waves. His eyes were the most striking feature, golden like molten metal, with vertical pupils that marked him unmistakably as something other than human. When he moved, it was with a fluid grace that spoke of barely contained power, of a predator who could strike with devastating speed if provoked. He wore robes of deep burgundy that seemed to shift and flow like liquid in the strange light, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in Kale's bones. So, Lientar said, rising from his throne and approaching with measured steps. This is the Omega Wolf you spoke of, the one with the healing voice. Indeed, my lord, the slaver leader said with obvious deference. Northern Pack bloodline, pure Omega genetics, and he carries the old blood that grants musical abilities. Perfect for your needs. Lientar circled Kale slowly, studying him with those unsettling golden eyes. Through his empathic abilities, Kale tried to read the dragon's emotions, but found only layers of complex thought and carefully controlled power. There was no cruelty there, but also no warmth, only ancient intelligence and a vast, patient loneliness that spoke of centuries spent in isolation. He's been mistreated, Lientar observed, noting the burns from the silver chains and Kale's obvious malnourishment. Damaged goods. Nothing that proper care won't remedy, my lord, the slaver said quickly. His voice is untouched, and his bloodline remains pure. He'll serve your purposes perfectly once he's recovered. And what exactly do you think my purposes are? Lientar asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made the slavers shift nervously. To have a singer, my lord. Someone to provide music for your entertainment. To help calm the draconic fury that all of your kind struggle with. We were told you needed someone with healing voice abilities. Lientar was quiet for a long moment, his golden gaze fixed on Kale's face with an intensity that made the Omega feel as though his soul was being measured and weighed. Finally, he nodded once. The price? 5,000 gold pieces, my lord. A bargain for such rare bloodline and abilities. Without hesitation, Lientar gestured to one of his servants, who immediately began counting out the payment. The transaction was completed with businesslike efficiency. Ownership of Kale's person transferred from the slavers to the Dragon Lord as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture or a hunting hound. As the slavers departed with their payment, Lientar turned his attention back to Kale, who was still bound and kneeling on the stone floor of the great hall. What is your name? The dragon asked, his voice gentler than it had been when dealing with the slave traders. Kale, he replied quietly, unsure whether he was supposed to add some form of honorific or title. Kale, Lientar repeated, as if testing the name. I am Lientar, though most here simply call me Lord Lien. You are no longer a slave, Kale. You are an employee of sorts. Your duties will be specific but not onerous. What duties? Kale asked, confused by this unexpected development. You will sing for me, Lientar said simply. Your healing voice will help calm the fire that burns in all dragons, the rage that comes with our nature and grows stronger with age. In exchange, you will have food, shelter, clothing, and safety. You may leave if you choose, but I suspect you have nowhere else to go. The accuracy of that statement hit Kale like a physical blow. He truly had nowhere else to go. No one who would help him, no resources to survive on his own. This Dragon Lord was offering him the closest thing to sanctuary he was likely to find in his current circumstances. I don't understand, Kale said. Why would you help me? Why treat me as anything more than property you just purchased? Lientar was quiet for a moment, his golden eyes reflecting something that might have been old pain. Because I know what it feels like to be cast out by those who should have valued you, he said finally. Because power without compassion is merely tyranny, and I've had enough of that to last several lifetimes. He gestured to one of his servants, a quiet man who had been waiting unobtrusively in the shadows. Marcus will show you to your quarters and see that you're properly fed and clothed. Rest for today. Tomorrow, we'll discuss your duties in more detail. As Kale was led through the corridors of the dragon's fortress, he found himself in a state of confused gratitude. He had expected slavery, abuse, or worse. Instead, he seemed to have found something approximating employment, however strange the circumstances. The quarters he was given were simple but comfortable. A bedroom, a small sitting area, and a workspace where he could practice his music if he chose. For the first time in weeks, he had hot food, clean clothes, and a warm bed. But more than that, he had been treated with a basic respect that he hadn't experienced since his exile. Lientar had spoken to him as if he were a person rather than an object, had offered him choice rather than simply imposing his will. That night, as he lay in his bed listening to the wind howl through the mountain peaks, Kale found himself wondering about the ancient dragon who had purchased his freedom along with his service. There had been something in those golden eyes, some echo of pain that resonated with his own experiences of rejection and loss. Perhaps, he thought, as sleep finally claimed him, this exile might lead to something better than the life he had lost. Perhaps there was hope in the most unexpected of places. The morning brought Marcus to his door with breakfast and an explanation of his daily routine. The servant was a middle-aged human who had been in Lientar's service for over a decade, and he spoke of his master with obvious respect and affection. Lord Lien is not what most people expect, Marcus explained as he laid out clothes that were simple but well-made. The stories they tell about dragons, most of them are false, at least where he's concerned. He's lived for over 1,000 years, seen empires rise and fall, watched friends and enemies alike crumble to dust. It changes you, that kind of perspective. What does he want from me? Kale asked. Really? Exactly what he said. Your voice, your music. Dragons carry a fire inside them that grows hotter with age and stress, can drive them to madness if left unchecked. Music, especially healing music from the old bloodlines, helps calm that fire. You'd be surprised how many talented musicians have found sanctuary here over the centuries. And if I refuse? If I decide I don't want to sing for him? Marcus shrugged. Then you don't sing. Lord Lien has never forced anyone to serve against their will. He might be disappointed, but he'd honor his word about letting you leave if you chose. The honesty in the man's voice convinced Kale that this wasn't some elaborate deception. For whatever reason, this ancient dragon seemed to operate by a code of ethics that included basic respect for others' autonomy. After breakfast, Marcus led him through the fortress to a large chamber that was clearly designed for music. The acoustics were perfect, with curved walls that would carry even the softest voice to every corner of the room. Instruments from dozens of different cultures were displayed along the walls, and comfortable seating was arranged to provide optimal listening positions. Lientar was waiting for them, seated in a chair near a massive window that looked out over the mountain landscape. In the daylight, Kale could see him more clearly, the subtle scales that appeared along his jawline when he was relaxed, the way his golden eyes caught and reflected light like precious gems, the sense of contained power that radiated from his deceptively human form. "Good morning, Kale," the dragon said, his voice carrying the same courteous tone he had used the night before. "I hope you slept well." "I did. Thank you," Kale replied, still uncertain of the proper protocol for addressing an ancient magical being who had technically purchased him but insisted on treating him as a guest. "I thought perhaps you could demonstrate your abilities today, if you're feeling up to it. Nothing elaborate, just whatever feels natural to you." Kale hesitated. He hadn't sung since his exile, hadn't wanted to use the gift that his former pack had decided was somehow defective. But looking at this dragon who had shown him more kindness in a single day than his own people had in weeks, he found himself wanting to try. He began with a simple melody, something his grandmother had taught him when he was young. The words were in the old tongue, a lullaby about safe harbors and peaceful rest. As his voice filled the chamber, he felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. The familiar warm sensation of his healing gift activating, the magic flowing through his voice and reaching out to touch the emotions of his listener. Through his empathic abilities, he could sense the change in Lientar immediately. The dragon's carefully controlled emotions began to settle, the ancient fire that burned constantly within him banking to a manageable level. For the first time in longer than Kale could measure, the Dragon Lord felt truly peaceful. When the song ended, they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Lientar spoke, his voice softer than before. "That was extraordinary," he said. "I haven't felt that calm in decades. Your gift is remarkable, Kale." "My pack didn't think so," Kale said bitterly. "They said it was evidence that I was defective, that my sensitivity had somehow corrupted my bond with my fated mate." "Your pack were fools," Lientar said with quiet conviction. "What you just did, that kind of healing magic, is incredibly rare and valuable. Anyone who would reject such a gift understands neither its worth nor the worth of the person who possesses it." The validation meant more to Kale than he could express. For the first time since his rejection, he felt like maybe his abilities weren't a flaw to be ashamed of but something genuinely valuable. "Would you like to see more of the fortress?" Lientar asked. I think you might find the library particularly interesting. I have collected texts on music and healing magic from across the known world. As they walked through the corridors together, Kale found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't thought possible. Lientar proved to be an excellent conversationalist, well-educated and thoughtful, with stories spanning centuries of experience. More importantly, he listened to Kale's responses with genuine interest, treating the young Omega's thoughts and opinions as worthy of consideration. The library was indeed spectacular, with shelves reaching from floor to ceiling and filled with books in dozens of languages. Ancient texts on magical theory sat alongside collections of folk songs, and treatises on healing practices were shelved next to philosophical works on the nature of emotions and empathy. Feel free to read anything that interests you, Lientar said. Knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. And if you find anything that helps you understand or develop your own abilities, so much the better. As the days passed, Kale settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. He sang for Lientar each morning and evening, using his healing voice to help calm the draconic fire that otherwise would have driven the ancient being to destructive fury. In return, he had access to the library, comfortable quarters, excellent food, and most importantly, respectful treatment from everyone in the fortress. Lientar proved to be a thoughtful and considerate employer. He never demanded more than Kale was willing to give, never pushed for personal information about his past, and never treated him as anything less than a valued member of his household. Slowly, carefully, something that might have been friendship began to develop between them. You don't have to tell me what happened to you, Lientar said one evening after Kale had finished his singing. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm willing to listen. Kale was quiet for a long moment, considering whether he was ready to share the story of his rejection and exile. Finally, he found himself speaking, the words coming easier than he had expected. I was supposed to be bonded to the alpha heir of my pack, he said quietly. Fated mates chosen by destiny itself. But when the time came for the ritual, he rejected me. Said I was defective, that I couldn't even trigger his proper mating instincts. He cast me out in front of everyone, and my own family said nothing to defend me. Lientar listened without judgment, his golden eyes reflecting sympathy and understanding. When Kale finished his story, the dragon was quiet for several minutes before responding. Their loss, he said simply. And perhaps your gain, though I know it doesn't feel that way now. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us clear the path for something better. Do you really believe that? I've lived long enough to see it proven true more often than not, Lientar replied. Pain and rejection are terrible teachers, but they're effective ones. They strip away illusions and force us to discover who we really are when everything else is taken away. As winter deepened in the mountains, Kale found himself thinking less about what he had lost and more about what he might be building. His voice grew stronger with daily practice, his empathic abilities developed in new directions as he learned to sense and respond to Lientar's complex emotional landscape, and his understanding of his own worth began to heal from the damage his rejection had caused. It was during one of the worst blizzards of the season that something shifted between them. Kale had been singing in the music chamber when the magical heating system fluctuated, leaving the room frigid and uncomfortable. Without thinking, Lientar moved closer and wrapped his own cloak around Kale's shoulders, the heavy fabric still warm from his body heat. Thank you, Kale said softly, and found himself looking up into those golden eyes from much closer than usual. You're welcome, Lientar replied, but he made no move to step away. For a moment, they stood close enough that Kale could see the subtle scales along the dragon's jawline, could feel the controlled power radiating from his deceptively human form. There was something in Lientar's expression, something vulnerable and uncertain that Kale had never seen before. Lien, Kale began. Not sure what he wanted to say, but knowing that this moment felt important, felt like a turning point. I should let you get warm, Lientar said, stepping back before anything more could be said. But something had changed between them. Some barrier had been crossed, and Kale found himself hoping it was the beginning of something beautiful rather than the end of the peace he had found. That night, as he lay in his bed listening to the storm rage outside, Kale found himself thinking not about the life he had lost, but about the life he might be building. For the first time since his exile, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. The change in their relationship was subtle but unmistakable. Lientar began seeking out Kale's company for reasons that had nothing to do with healing music. They shared meals together, discussed philosophy and history by the fire, and spent long evenings in comfortable companionship. Lientar encouraged Kale to develop his abilities, providing him with ancient texts on empathic magic and genuine interest in his growing insights. "Your empathy is evolving," Lientar observed one evening as they sat together in his study, Kale having just provided a remarkably accurate assessment of the emotional undercurrents in a piece of diplomatic correspondence. "It's becoming more focused, more intentional. It doesn't hurt anymore," Kale said with some surprise. "Before, feeling others' emotions was overwhelming, often painful. Now it's more like having an additional sense that provides useful information. Perhaps because you're no longer surrounded by people who radiate contempt and disappointment," Lientar suggested with a slight smile. "Empathy is much more pleasant when you're around those who care for you." The casual admission made Kale's heart skip a beat. "You care for me?" Lientar was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the firelight. "More than I should, perhaps. More than is wise for someone in my position. But yes, Kale, I care for you very much." Their first kiss happened on a clear winter night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green and gold. They had been standing on one of the fortress's high balconies, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the celestial display, when Kale found himself studying Lientar's profile in the ethereal light. "You're staring," Lientar observed without turning his head, but his tone was amused rather than annoyed. "You're beautiful," Kale replied honestly, past the point of hiding his feelings. "The most beautiful being I've ever seen." Lientar did turn then, his golden eyes searching Kale's face with an intensity that made the Omega's breath catch. "Kale," he said softly, and there was a question in his voice, a request for permission. "Yes," Kale whispered, and leaned forward to meet him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When they broke apart, Lientar rested his forehead against Kale's, his breath visible in the cold air. "I don't want to take advantage," he said quietly. "You've been through so much, and the circumstances that brought you here are irrelevant now," Kale finished firmly. "I'm not choosing you because I'm grateful or because I have nowhere else to go. I'm choosing you because being with you makes me feel whole for the first time in my life. Are you certain?" Instead of answering with words, Kale kissed him again, pouring all of his certainty and affection into the contact. This time, Lientar responded with equal passion, his arms coming up to wrap around Kale's waist and draw him closer against the winter cold. What followed was the most beautiful courtship of Kale's life. Lientar treated him like something precious, something to be cherished rather than possessed. Their physical relationship developed slowly, at Kale's pace, with constant communication and mutual respect. When they finally came together completely, it was with a passion tempered by tenderness, a claiming that was mutual and joyful. "Mine," Lientar whispered against Kale's throat as they moved together in the firelight, his voice rough with emotion and ancient longing. "Yours," Kale agreed, arching beneath him as pleasure built to impossible heights. "And you're mine." In the morning, Kale woke in Lientar's arms feeling more complete than he ever had before. This wasn't the forced connection of a fated bond, but something he had chosen freely, something that belonged to him and to Lientar alone. "No regrets?" Lientar asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Kale's bare skin. "None," Kale said, meaning it completely. "Only gratitude that I was finally free to choose for myself." Their happiness continued for several weeks, but it was during the early spring that Kale made a discovery that changed everything. He had been feeling unwell for several days. Not sick exactly, but strange in ways he couldn't quite define. His empathic abilities had become hypersensitive, his appetite had changed, and he found himself experiencing mood swings that were entirely unlike his usual emotional stability. When the realization hit him, it was with the force of a physical blow. He was pregnant. The broken bond with Taris, severed so violently and publicly, had consequences beyond emotional devastation. The magical backlash had triggered biological changes that he was only now beginning to understand. The child wasn't Lientar's, the timing made that impossible. It was a remnant of the fated bond that had been so brutally rejected, a final gift or curse from the connection that Taris had destroyed. In Omega werewolf physiology, sometimes the trauma of bond rejection could cause the body to react by creating life from the magical energy that had nowhere else to go. Kale sat in his room for hours, trying to process this development and what it might mean for his newfound happiness with Lientar. Would the dragon still want him, knowing he carried another's child? Would this pregnancy be seen as a reminder of his rejected status, proof that he was still fundamentally tied to the pack that had cast him out? When he finally worked up the courage to tell Lientar, he found the dragon in his study, working on correspondence with other ancient beings across the continent. Lientar took one look at his face and immediately set aside his work. "What's wrong?" he asked, his golden eyes filled with concern. "I'm pregnant," Kale said simply, watching carefully for Lientar's reaction. The dragon was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The broken bond?" he asked finally. "Yes, it's not yours. The timing doesn't work. It's from the rejection, the magical backlash. I understand if this changes things between us." To Kale's surprise, Lientar smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his golden eyes. "It changes nothing between us," he said firmly. "If anything, it makes me love you more." "How can you say that? This child is a reminder of my rejection, of my failure. This child," Lientar interrupted gently, "is proof of your strength. Your body created life from trauma, hope from devastation. That's not failure, Kale. That's the most profound magic imaginable." He stood and moved to kneel beside Kale's chair, taking his hands in his own. "If you want this child, then we'll raise it together. It will be ours in every way that matters. And if you don't want it, we'll find someone who will love and care for it properly. But either way, it doesn't change how I feel about you." Tears spilled down Kale's cheeks as the last of his fears dissolved. "I want it," he whispered. "I want our child." "Then that's what we'll have," Lientar said, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Our child, our family, our choice." As news of Kale's pregnancy began to spread through the magical networks that connected isolated communities across the continent, it eventually reached the ears of those he had hoped never to encounter again. The Northern Pack had not forgotten their rejected Omega, and the knowledge that he was not only alive but thriving, and now carrying a child that should have been born into their bloodline, sparked a fury that demanded action. The attack came without warning on a warm spring morning when Kale was in his 7th month of pregnancy. He was in the garden behind the fortress, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air, when the first howls echoed across the mountain peaks. Through his empathic abilities, he immediately sensed the approach of his former pack. Their rage, their determination, their intent to reclaim what they saw as stolen property. Lientar was beside him within moments, his dragon senses having detected the threat even before Kale's empathic warning. "Get inside," he said firmly. "Let me handle this." "No," Kale said, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "I won't hide anymore. I won't let them chase me away from another home." "Kale, you're pregnant. It's too dangerous." "It's my choice," Kale interrupted. "My life, my child, my decision. I'm done being a victim." By the time the Northern Pack reached the fortress gates, Kale and Lientar were waiting for them together. Taris led the group, his steel-gray eyes burning with a fury that had been building for months. Behind him came Alpha Magnus and a full war party, armed and ready for battle. "You will return what belongs to us," Taris snarled, his gaze fixed on Kale's obviously pregnant form. "That child should have been born into our pack, raised as one of our own. You have no right to deny us our bloodline." "I have every right," Kale replied calmly, his hand resting protectively on his swollen belly. "You rejected me, remember? You cast me out, declared me worthless, stripped me of my name and my place. You gave up any claim to me or anything that comes from me. The child is different, Alpha Magnus said coldly. Whatever your failings, the bloodline itself is valuable. We demand its return. You demand nothing, Lientar said, stepping forward with power radiating from his human form like heat from a forge. This is my territory. These are my guests, and you are trespassing with hostile intent. Leave now or face the consequences. We're not afraid of one dragon, Tari said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. Perhaps you should be, Lientar replied, and for a moment his golden eyes flared with inner fire that spoke of his true nature barely contained beneath human flesh. But before the confrontation could escalate into violence, Kale stepped forward and did something no one expected. He began to sing. It wasn't a healing song this time, but something far more powerful. Using his empathic abilities, he reached out to touch the minds and hearts of every wolf present, forcing them to feel what he had felt during his rejection and exile. The loneliness, the despair, the crushing weight of being cast out by those who should have loved and protected him. But he didn't stop there. He also showed them what he had found since leaving them, the peace, the love, the sense of belonging and purpose that came from being valued for who he was rather than what he represented. He let them feel Lientar's deep and abiding affection, the joy they had built together, the hope for the future that grew stronger each day. The effect was immediate and devastating. Several of the younger pack members dropped their weapons, overwhelmed by the contrast between the cruelty they had shown and the happiness their rejection had ultimately enabled. Others began to question the wisdom of their leaders, the righteousness of their cause. This is what you destroyed, Kale said when his song ended, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. This is what your fear and prejudice cost all of us. You could have had my loyalty, my healing voice, my children raised as proud members of your pack. Instead, you chose cruelty over compassion, tradition over truth. You were defective, Tari said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The bond failed to form properly. The bond failed because you never truly wanted it, Kale interrupted. My empathic abilities showed me your truth from the beginning. You were afraid of binding yourself to someone who might actually see past your mask, who might demand emotional honesty instead of just submission. You rejected me to protect yourself, not the pack. Through his empathic gifts, Kale could sense the change in the assembled wolves. Doubt was spreading, certainty cracking, old assumptions being questioned for the first time in years. Several of the younger pack members were looking at their leaders with new understanding, beginning to see the fear and insecurity that drove their harsh decisions. I am not weak, Kale continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I am not defective. I am not a failed Omega who couldn't inspire proper mating instincts. I am a healer, a singer, a person worthy of love and respect. You simply weren't capable of seeing my strength until it became a threat to your control. The confrontation might have continued, but at that moment, something unexpected happened. A group of the younger pack members stepped forward, separating themselves from the main group and moving to stand behind Kale and Lientar. We're done, one of them said. A young beta named Kieran who had always been kind to Kale during their youth. Done with leaders who rule through fear. Done with traditions that value conformity over compassion. Done with a pack that would rather destroy happiness than admit they were wrong. Others followed, until nearly a third of the war party had defected to Kale's side. The remaining wolves looked uncertain, their unity shattered by this unprecedented rebellion against Alpha authority. You're making a mistake, Alpha Magnus said coldly, but his authority was clearly shaken. The old ways exist for a reason. Without strong leadership and clear hierarchies, packs fall into chaos. The only chaos here is the kind you create, Kieran replied. Kale has shown us what real strength looks like. The courage to build something new instead of just enforcing something old. The standoff continued for several more hours, but eventually, it became clear that the Northern Pack's mission had failed. They had come to reclaim their property and found instead a person who had grown beyond their ability to control or intimidate. They had expected to face a broken, submissive Omega and instead encountered someone who had found his voice, his strength, and his place in the world. As they prepared to depart, Taris approached Kale one final time. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "The child you carry, it's still part of our bloodline. We have rights. You have no rights here," Kale said firmly. "My child will be raised in love, not fear. They'll be taught that their worth comes from who they are, not what others expect them to be. They'll never know the pain of rejection from those who should protect them." As the northern pack disappeared back into the mountains, taking with them their wounded pride and diminished numbers, Kale felt a profound sense of closure. He had faced his past and emerged victorious, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple act of refusing to be diminished by others' limitations. The wolves who had chosen to stay helped build a new settlement in the valley below Lientar's fortress, creating a community based on acceptance rather than hierarchy, love rather than fear. It became a haven for outcasts and refugees from traditional pack structures, a place where individuals could find their own path regardless of their background or biological status. 3 months later, Kale gave birth to a healthy son in the spring sunshine, surrounded by the family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return. The child was perfect, a blend of werewolf and ancient magical heritage that spoke of new possibilities rather than old constraints. "What shall we name him?" Lientar asked, cradling the infant with the wonder of someone experiencing parenthood for the first time in over 1,000 years of existence. "Aiden," Kale said without hesitation. "It means little fire, like you, but small and perfect and full of potential." As the years passed, their unconventional family thrived. Kale became the settlement's primary healer and teacher, using his voice and empathic abilities to help others find their own strength and purpose. Lientar served as protector and wise counselor, his ancient knowledge and power ensuring that their community remained safe from those who would impose their old ways through force. Aiden grew into a remarkable child, inheriting his father's empathic gifts and his other father's deep wisdom. He learned that families came in all forms, that love was more important than tradition, and that everyone deserved the chance to find their place in the world. It was on Aiden's 5th birthday, during the settlement's annual celebration of new beginnings, that an unexpected visitor arrived. Taris appeared at the festival, alone and clearly travel-worn, his once proud bearing replaced by something that looked like humility. "I come to ask forgiveness," he said simply when he found Kale among the celebrating families. "Not for my sake, but because I need you to know that I finally understand what I threw away." Kale studied his former fated mate for a long moment, using his empathic abilities to sense the genuine remorse and regret that radiated from the alpha. There was no deception there, no hidden agenda, only the honest pain of a man who had finally learned the cost of his choices. "You rejected everything I offered," Kale said quietly. "My love, my loyalty, my healing voice, my strength. You cast me out because you were afraid of who I might help you become." "I know," Tari said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know, and I've regretted it every day since. The pack is fracturing without the unity your healing presence provided. Young wolves are leaving to find communities like this one, where they can be valued for who they are rather than forced into roles that don't fit. I've watched everything I thought I was protecting crumble because I was too proud and too afraid to embrace what you offered. And now," Kale asked, "now I'm alone as I deserve to be. But I had to come here, had to see what you built, had to ask your forgiveness even though I know I don't deserve it." Kale looked around the festival, at the families celebrating together regardless of their species or background, at his son playing with children who would grow up knowing that love came in many forms, at Lientar watching over them all with patient devotion. "I forgive you," he said finally. "But my life is here now. My family, my home, my purpose, everything I am belongs to this place and these people. I'm not the broken Omega you rejected anymore, Taris. I'm the song I chose to sing, and it's beautiful." As Taris departed, carrying with him the knowledge that forgiveness was possible even if restoration was not, Kale felt the final chapter of his old life close. He was no longer defined by rejection but by the love he had found and built. He was no longer a victim of others' limitations but a creator of new possibilities. That evening, as the festival continued around them, Kale sat with Lientar and Aiden under the stars, sharing stories and songs that would become the foundation of their family's legacy. They were not bound by fate or tradition, but by the conscious choice to love without conditions, to build without fear, and to believe that every soul deserved the chance to find their true home. In the end, Kale had learned the most important truth of all, that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the package of apparent loss, and that the courage to sing your own song, regardless of who chooses not to listen, is the most powerful magic in any world.